Hey everyone, I'm back again. I know, twice in one day. Um, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about consistency and share my tips or what I've learned about consistency and how I've been able to stay consistent in creating content for Content Heroes. So if you haven't had a chance, go check out today's episode with Shane Sams. We talk about building predictable, um, uh, recurring revenue for your business with membership communities. And also, we talk about Shane's framework for building organic growth in those communities. And one of the things he talks about is his CPR framework. So being consistent, prolific, and relentless. So I want to take a minute to talk about consistency and why consistency is important. I'm sure if you had a friend that always said that they were going to show up at a certain time, on a certain day, and they never showed up on that time or that day, or maybe half the time they showed up, you probably wouldn't trust that friend very much, because how you do one thing is how you do everything. And if they're not going to do what they say in something as simple as being somewhere at a certain time, then it's hard to trust them with other things that they say or they do. Ooh, still working on getting rid of that cold. And so it's incredibly important with your audience. You probably already know that, but I also think that one thing that is overlooked is it's incredibly important in building trust with yourself. And that's something that I have learned, definitely. And I think that's really underrated, because in order to be a business leader, in order to have the confidence to step out and put yourself out there and create something and do something meaningful in the world, you really need to learn how to trust yourself. And if you are struggling with being consistent, it's really hard to set goals and to really try to achieve anything, because there's always going to be that voice in the back of your head that says, you can't do this. Look at all these other times when you said you were going to do this and you didn't. And so to me, consistency has been a primary driver in me learning to trust myself and to know that, hey, I do have what it takes to do the things that I want to do. And I have a track record now to prove that. And so it's incredibly important. And so I also want to take a second to share like what consistency has looked like for me. So, and this is especially near and dear to my heart, because it's been a big deal for me, because Josiah a few years ago looks nothing like Josiah today, right? And so Josiah a few years ago would have never started a podcast, and if he had, he definitely wouldn't have made it past a few episodes. And the reason for that is historically I've not been a super consistent person. I tend to not like rigid structure. I don't really like people telling me what to do and telling me I have to be somewhere at a certain time. I have to be somewhere at a certain time. Josh says, I love all Josiahs. Thank you, Josh. But and thank you, Josh, for completely throwing my train of thought there. Yeah, so I never used to be a consistent person, and learning to become consistent and committing to that has really changed a lot of stuff for me. And so it's a big deal to me that I've published 52 episodes of Content Heroes in less than a year. Like, I have shown up, with the exception of one period I'll talk about in a second. I've shown up consistently week after week, sometimes twice a week, publishing episodes and putting myself out there and showing my audience that I follow through on the things that I say I'm going to do, and showing myself that I follow through on the things that I say I'm going to do. And I went, I think, 7 months before I took a break. I went from October until May. And then with everything that was going on with the quarantine and some stuff that was happening in my family, I just needed a mental health break. And so I decided to take a few weeks off, and just kind of regroup. But it was interesting what happened in during that time frame, and I think this is when stuff really started to click for me, that what I was doing. Because when I first started Content Heroes, if you followed that journey, it was a lot of like, I don't really know where this is going, but I have this thing inside of me I have to get out, and I want to see where it goes. But it was in this time period when I took this a few weeks off, where something really started to click of, oh, I've actually built something here. And it was, I hadn't I hadn't been paying a ton of attention to the stats, but I had been looking at downloads kind of as I published new episodes, and really just kind of in my head, it was, oh, I published an episode and this is the amount of downloads I got in this week for this episode. When I went a few weeks without publishing, I was still getting like emails from my podcast host, and it was like, your podcast got 50 downloads this week, or 80 downloads this week, or 100 downloads this week. And I'm like, this doesn't, like, I haven't published anything. And I realized people are still finding the podcast. And when they do, and this is the beautiful thing about podcasting, that I feel like no other platform really provides this in this way, but they find you, and if they connect with you, if they like you, then they go back through your catalog and they listen and go all the way back. And people were continuing to do that. And because I had stayed consistent and I had built up this body of work that was valuable to people, they went and consumed it, and they came into my ecosystem and into the conversations that I was having. And that never would have happened. I would have not had that in place if I hadn't been consistent. And so it's incredibly important. And it's really changed the game for me in terms of how I've started to approach everything that I do. So I want to share with you I call them my 3 consistency activators. All right. So the first one, you've heard me talk about this before. And the first one is commitment, because you have to start there. And that's definitely where it started for me. Like, if you've heard me talk about the podcast at the beginning, the podcast came because I decided I was going to commit 100% before I had the name, before I had the idea. I had all these stories around, like, it's not going to work out. Why would anyone listen to my podcast? I don't know what I would create a podcast about, all of this stuff. But then I decided I was going to commit 100%. And you've heard me talk about, 100% committed is easy, 99% committed is hard. And I closed that 1% gap. And and when I did, everything just started to fall into place. But I had to make that decision, and I had to define what my non-negotiables were. Like, what is it at the end of the day that I am committing to, with, like, no matter what happens, these things are the things I'm going to do. So get really clear on what your non-negotiables are, and make that decision to commit. And then once you do, it's really important to stay focused. So that's my consistency activator number 2 is focus. It's also really important to take those non-negotiables and get really clear on what is a priority to achieve those and what is not. So for me, I realized that because I was starting from scratch, I didn't have an audience at all. I didn't have any content at all. I had nothing. I had to focus on the actual content production first. I had to get good at that. I had to get a system in place for that. And I had to be diligent about that. And that's where my focus was on my consistency. So my non-negotiables were, I was going to publish every week. And so publishing was my priority. And so on the weeks, that meant that on the weeks, because I only had so much bandwidth. So on the weeks where everything else got chaotic, and I was also, I was doing this and running my agency at the same time. On those weeks, sometimes I wouldn't even like promote the episode, which just sounds kind of crazy. But to me, it was like, I just need to make sure that I'm publishing, right? And some people will still find it, and that's okay. But if I don't have time to put together social posts and do all this stuff, at least I'm drawing a line in the sand, and I'm not going to let that stop me from still publishing. And so I focused on that, and that's where I built those muscles and got that routine down. And so for me, it's I went a whole 7 months before I even took a break from that, and then I haven't stopped since after I took that break. And then the third thing was the third consistency activator is process. And this is very, very important to me as well, because the way that I'm wired, I have more of a technical engineering type background, and so I oftentimes think in systems and processes. And so I'm very, very thankful, because I knew at the beginning the way that I was going to stay consistent is if I could quickly put together a process that would allow me to take the creative energy that's a finite resource, and focus that on the things that I actually need to use it for, like the strategy and the content itself. And then all of the other little things, if I could systematize those or automate those or delegate those, or I call it, like, go into mindless manual mode, where at least I have a checklist and I don't have to really think about it, and I can copy and paste. I did that. So I put together a process from the very beginning, and then refined it week after week after week, and just made sure that I didn't have to think the stuff that shouldn't require brain power. It still does, like even so much as like typing up an email to send to the guest who's on this episode to let them know, hey, your episode's been released. Here's all the stuff for it. I just that much friction is enough to make it a mental chore to publish an episode. And so I want to make sure that I'm removing as much friction as possible. And I want to make things as easy as possible, and as much mindless manual mode or automating or delegating, whatever. And so my process has been, it's been invaluable to me. And it's the only reason why I've been able to be consistent for so long, because I got a really great process in place, to the point where the way that I've built it out, it's really cool. Kind of nerd out on it, but it allows me to not think about things. And I've actually produced a lot of the podcast myself, when rather than handing it off to a producer. And how I was able to do that was through the process. And so I'm able to, as I'm going through, it kind of builds itself out to the point where, like, for example, I have to send that email to a guest. I literally just click a button, and it has a template where all of the stuff that they need has already been injected into the template automatically. And I just click a button and I hit schedule, and the email gets scheduled and sends at the appropriate time. And all of those little tiny things are taken care of, and I don't have to really think about it, and I can focus on the stuff that matters. And so the three consistency activators are commitment, focus, and process. And that's how you stay consistent in your content, and consistent in publishing your content. And that's how you build trust with your audience over the long term. And that is how you build trust with yourself. And so I'll be digging into all this more in my upcoming book. So make sure that you, among many other things, and so make sure that you join the waitlist for that. ContentHeroes.com/book. Get on the waitlist. Be one of the first to get your hands on a copy. And until next time, go be a hero.